I'm Jim Neal, one of the consultants at the Georgia Center for Nonprofits. Listen and share and hopefully be a part of a good dialogue with nonprofit leaders about trends and predictions for 2022. I'm joined by Donna and Elizabeth. We're all here to share some insights and thoughts on the year ahead and address questions that you have. So let's dive into kind of the first topic is just the outlook. And as we thought about this and our team researched different aspects of the nonprofit environment, nonprofit leadership, we came down to a couple of key themes that we wanted to frame this with. The notion of returning to normal is something that we just need to set aside, because as the first part of this year has demonstrated, the idea of getting hopefully back to something is not going to be the case in 2022. There's going to be this constant change. We're in a season of uncertainty. So we're framing these thoughts in the context that we're all working together in this idea of, well, what's the next normal? And then the next normal after that, and the future normal. So while all this uncertainty is underway and you're having to lead and make good decisions in that, we're also seeing continued increased expectations from everyone that we touch, certainly our funders, the stakeholders that surround our organizations, the people we serve, and our employees. So a couple of anchoring outlooks to keep in mind. And in response to those two dynamics of uncertainty and increased expectations, we thought it would be best to take a very tactical frame to our conversation today. So we're going to be talking specifically about tactics, talent, and technology today. So let's move in and dive in. All of this, in our view, is framed by a couple of cross-cutting themes, things that we would encourage you to think through your tactics, talent, and technology and what you do in your nonprofits through lenses of being aware of both culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's the classic statement, most change efforts fail, and most of those failures are related to a misalignment of culture to what's being attempted. The culture is not ready, the culture is not aligned to respond to the change that is a good one that's being proposed and put forth. So we have to be aware of culture, because in this period of uncertainty, in this time of the next and the next and the next normal, there's going to be a lot of change that we all have to navigate. The rich conversation, the rich set of dialogues and initiatives and efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion have moved us to a point, in our view, in which we need to shift to accountability and action. The people that surround us are looking for more than stats or numbers or our intentions. They're looking for, and the people that work with us within our organization are looking for very tangible actions. How does this awareness that's been building and invested in manifest itself into tangible action? So we're going to be thinking about equity and inclusion in that lens as well. As we talk about some very tactical things, it's still important to be considering DEI and culture. So we're in the next normal. So let's talk about some tactics and go on to the next one about strategy. 2022 is not a year to do a big, long-range, complicated strategic planning effort looking way ahead with a long process, because there's too much volatility, complexity, and ambiguity. It would be an exercise in frustration and misalign your team and your culture to the importance of shorter planning horizons, using scenario planning techniques, meaning identifying what are some potential outcomes in the year or 18 months ahead and how might your organization respond to them, and anticipating different options. The idea here is this may be more of a year for a plan refresh or a review or a dive into specific components of it in light of the pace of change that's going on. Mission alignment is going to be critical in 2022, because many organizations did a lot of great work in pivoting into pandemic conditions, crisis response, meeting the needs of the people they serve in different ways, different partnerships, different initiatives in response to those conditions. Noble efforts, good efforts, and important work. As we transition into the next normal and the next normal, we're still obviously dealing with pandemic effects and will for a while. And yet much of that crisis response may have brought us into mission creep, where our organization and our people are out doing things that may not be well aligned or sustainably aligned with the organization and our core mission that helped frame it and focus us up into the pandemic. So we're going to have a poll question here, and I'd like to ask you to think about, do you think your organization has pivoted into some mission creep in the last 2 years? Okay, the folks who have, oh, great. 55% say no, we haven't. About 27 say yes, and 18% not sure. So for those of you who feel confident about mission creep has been managed, good for you. I appreciate that. And so we may have a different dimension to mission alignment conversation. Those that are on the yes or not sure, we would encourage you to think through what you can be doing in terms of calling your team together, engaging people, back to this notion of an engaging culture, that you want to get more people involved in the dynamics here, and having good conversations about your mission, about where the last couple of years have taken you and where you might go. If you feel confident about your mission alignment and haven't experienced mission creep, this might be a good time to take a look at programmatic offerings in terms of sustainability and how are those aligned with the capabilities that you have to take them forward. So a couple of thoughts on strategy tactics. We'll shift to fundraising, and Donna.
So we're going to do a quick little poll here on fundraising, because we are all finalizing our year ends and figuring out where we stood last year. So we're just going to ask a really simple question. Was your funding up, down, or the same? So fundraising is a perennial issue for us, and the time since 2020 feels like a decade to me as a nonprofit fundraiser, and the change continues to roll in. So I think along with organizational change in general, let's look at this poll. It looks like we've got about 50% up, 30% down, and 17% that is even. So I'm gonna round that up and say, if you're even or up, that's 67%. That's just fantastic. Looking at these tactics, what would we recommend and what do we see? Look at that growth. So some sectors really experienced some growth. Human services is one of those, and they experienced strong growth in 2020 and in 21. And so one tactic that we would recommend, if you grew, or especially if you did not, is to revise your communications to your donors. You probably have some new donors. You've got some new major donors and some fluctuations in what your donor pool looks like. So revising your communications is a great idea, whether you have new ones that you need to bring them up to speed and really engage their passions and align them with your organization, or if you need to shift that a little bit as if your funding is down. So I would recommend that you look at focusing your donor communications on the challenges that either your organization or the people who benefit from your organization have experienced, either through the pandemic or what they're experiencing now as a result of it, and coordinate, polish all of your communications, streamline them for continuity across all departments and programs, and take the opportunity to revise your talking points as an organization across all of your areas, and then train your team, train your board, train your program delivery departments, and train your fundraisers on what your talking points are. What have you seen? What are the changes? And start delivering your communications in a different way. Another tactic for fundraisers is to contact your funders in this change. Have you had a conversation with your corporate donors and your foundation funders to find out what are they projecting for 2022? They've also experienced great change, maybe great growth, or maybe some contraction there. So find out early in the year, what are their projections, and how can your organization either take advantage of that by maybe applying for funding in an area that you haven't before, or changing. and looking at new funders for those programs if you see that some funding is going to go away. So measurement. Measure and evaluate more often. I probably should have made that number one in any given year, but taking some deep dives into your performance on a monthly basis is going to give you, it's going to show you some new patterns of giving and show you those new donors and give you some time for making course corrections if you need to, or again, tailoring those communications to meet those new donors and their interest in your organization. And lastly, I want to say, don't forget your middle donors in here. So many organizations focus on either acquiring new donors or acquiring those big major gifts. And so as you look at that, we forget that middle part. But those middle donors, that middle tier, increases there lead to more major gifts. So those middle donors are really critical to your fundraising tactics in 2022. And now I think I'm going to turn this over to Elizabeth for some organizational strategy.
All right. And I did see one question about talent, which we'll get to in a minute. But first, I want to kind of round off the tactics and talk about organizational growth. And I think I saw some comments already in the chat box about, folks having plans, right? But implementation did not go according to plan, which we certainly understand. And we've worked with many organizations over the last 2 years, trying to help them recalibrate, reset, reassess. But one thing that is really critical is making sure that you have some goals for your organization, right? And that they're measurable and actionable. And as Jim mentioned already, you want to make sure that that time horizon is in the short term, right? So certainly, you can think through where do we want to be in 3 years, but you want to make sure that you've got some concrete goals for the next 12, 18, 24 months, and that they are based on the organization you are today, not the organization that you hope to be in the future. The other thing which we're going to cover a little more in depth as we move through the rest of the materials today is now is the time to invest in growth or change within your organization. Again, Jim kind of kicked us off, just reminding everyone that change is difficult. And that statistic around, change efforts failing, that comes from some research that was done by McKinsey and Company. So change is hard. And I know most folks are sort of feeling that probably within their organizations. But we want to encourage you to think about your people, right? And so people across the organization, I think some, currently folks automatically go to people in terms of staff, but we do also want you to think about your board and volunteers if you have them, because there's been some major shifts within the volunteer force in the last 2 years. Technology, which we're going to touch on later in terms of, why that is at this point really essential. And certainly, communication, and that certainly, leads across the organization, and then culture, right? Because I'm sure many of you guys have heard us and other people repeat the old adage, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So you can have the best strategy, the best plans, but if you really haven't thought through how are you going to shift or adapt your culture to support that, you're going to have, some significant challenges. So you want to make sure, and also on the flip side, if you happen to have an organization where your culture has really adapted and kind of, you've been able to rise to the challenges that we've all been dealing with over the last 2 years, you want to make sure that you're continuing, right? And being thoughtful and intentional about supporting the things that have kept that positive change going. All right, now we're going to shift into talent. Is talent retention an important issue for your organization? How are you guys feeling about that at this moment? This is not surprising that 77% of you are saying yes. And I would say for those that are feeling no, we have a great team, everything is fine. I think you probably do want to think about retention. Maybe not, your team is committed right now. There are some trends that we do want you all to be aware of and to be thinking about. So let's talk a little bit about talent in general. So you all are probably well aware, right, given national media reports, right? We're in the middle of the Great Resignation, and just related to how tight the labor market has gotten, we're really wanting folks to think about, the fact that hiring and retaining is going to be more difficult than it has been. So, we're going to see turnover, and I think there were a couple of comments already about turnover, particularly in the development roles. Salary costs are going to increase, which I know, as there's CEOs and executive directors on this call, and that's not necessarily great news. But I do want to remind folks, one of the things, particularly, millennials, Gen Z, right, who are entering the workforce, they are really looking for mission aligned organizations, right? And so that is one area where the nonprofit sector really has an advantage. So I would certainly encourage you all, if you're not thinking about how to highlight that, make sure that your employees and potential hires really understand your mission impact. That's just going to become much more critical. The other thing, and we'll touch on this in a bit as well, continuing to think about what are the capabilities, that our staff needs moving forward, right? So what is that upskilling that we may need to do as an organization, and really think through, how are we assessing and determining that? What is our training and development plan? And the other thing too, particularly again with millennials and Gen Z, thinking around what does our career pathing look like, right? What is sort of our horizontal and vertical movement, right? And I know one of the things that's traditionally a challenge within the nonprofit world is that career ladder, right? Particularly for smaller organizations. But we would encourage you guys to think about, are there stretch projects, stretch opportunities that you can really focus on for your high performers, right? To try to keep them, retain them a little bit longer than maybe you would. Now I want to shift and talk about leadership. So that's another thing, trend that we're seeing that's really, certainly empathetic leadership, was happening pre-pandemic, but this is something that's really been accelerated during the pandemic, right? Leaders really need to have the ability to understand the needs of others, right? And we're seeing more and more of a focus on servant leadership, right? Which was maybe not a traditional leadership style that some organizations had in the past, right? So if this is something that is a little bit new to your organization, we would encourage you as a leader, but also your teams, right? Even at the supervisor level, to get some training and understanding around emotional intelligence, so that you can really understand and adapt to what the employees of today are really looking for. And so in terms of what that empathetic leader, looks like, and as Jim mentioned at the top, really making sure that your leadership team across the organization understands, what does diversity, equity, and particularly inclusion, and I think some of you have probably seen there's also now kind of a shift to belonging, right? So it's not that we've created an organization, a culture that is aware, right? It's now we're really moving into action, right? And employees are demanding that action. So we want to make sure, again, that your leaders, managers, supervisors have empathy, are compassionate, understand, right, the perspectives of staff members, but also the clients that you're working with. And as we've already mentioned, again, making sure that you've got communication and culture that demonstrates that empathy. And one thing too we're seeing is you want to make sure that you are thinking through the whole organization, right? So I think sometimes there's a focus at a specific level, but that's really what talent and the talent pool is looking for now. So I want to move on to recruiting, and clearly some of you guys, based on your comments already, have highlighted this. So, again, recruiting is going to take work, right? We do a fair amount of search at the executive level, but also at the director level, and things are just taking a lot more time. And, you really, again, need to clearly in your communications, whether it's a job description, a job posting, define your culture, right? And really make sure that folks understand, again, what's the impact that your organization is having? What type of culture do you have? How do you support your employees? And the other thing I will say, because we do operate Work for Good, the nonprofit specific job board, posting your salary. That's sort of the number one feedback piece that we get from our job seekers. Actually, now we're getting people just saying, hey, I'm not applying if I don't see a salary range. This is a candidate's market, right? Which can be a little challenging. We are competing against other sectors. And so you want to be able to leverage the things that make your organization unique. You also really need to make sure that you're working your network, right? So, we've seen definitely an increase in organizations using employee referrals. So think through, what can your organization afford to sort of sustain there? You also really want to have a very strong and concise and clear interview process, right? So that you're moving candidates through that pipeline quickly so you can make a decision. And as I mentioned already, really highlighting that purpose-driven, impact that your organization is having. All right, so in terms of retention, as we've talked about already, that's critical. And I'm glad that so many of you all are already thinking about it. It's on your radar screen. And, just in terms of the nonprofit sector as a whole, in a survey that was done by an organization focused on the nonprofit sector, 84% of nonprofits said they did not have a formal strategy for recruitment and retention, right? And so that's something that we feel like as a sector, we've got to really focus on. So thinking about, how do we signal to our employees that we're investing in them, right? And so one way to do that is through employee training and development. Also, as I mentioned earlier, thinking through what are opportunities for growth, right? So are there ways to give employees opportunities to really, practice that learning, upskill, the things that they might have picked up from a class, but actually use that within your organization, and highlight and focus on their work. And then compensation, again, is one thing that we really are encouraging folks to think through. What does compensation need to look like now, today, right? And so we've done quite a few compensation studies within the last year, and had some really open and frank conversations with our clients around, this may have been market rate 2 years ago, 3 years ago, but it's not now, right? And we're certainly seeing wage pressures across, but I think this has already kind of come out in the chat. One functional area where wages have just increased pretty significantly would be the development team. So many of you are probably having those conversations, getting that feedback from your staff. So those wages have increased pretty significantly. And then also for those of you that do have larger staff, client-facing staff, that front line, those folks also are, seeing those opportunities to go work in the for-profit sector where they could be making $1, $2, even sometimes $3 an hour additionally. And what we're finding is that folks, even who may be motivated by, the impact that they're having in the nonprofit sector, are just saying, hey, I can't afford, to lose out on that additional $1, $2. So I'm going to have to make a different employment choice. All right, so I want to hand it back over to Jim to talk about technology.
Yeah, our third T of the day is technology, and we've seen in your introductory comments in the chat, some folks are interested in technology in the nonprofit space. We see it as being, it's going to be a critical enabler of what nonprofits do across their work, from direct client delivery to measuring and reporting on impact, navigating the workforce, and certainly engaging supporters and funders and volunteers. Has your organization adopted enough technology to be effective? And some people lean into conversations about technology and some people lean back. So it'd be interesting to watch the camera and see how people react to this. Okay, 24% of you have said we've adopted enough technology to be effective. 2/3, 65% are working on it. 11% are saying, nope, we're not there. So I'm encouraged, and I hope you should all be encouraged by that, working on it or have it in place. Let's talk a bit about working on it and maybe some things to be thinking about to frame your working on it going forward. And we'll talk about it from a strategy and a fundraising and an organization development perspective. From a strategy perspective, it's easy for nonprofit organizations to get pulled toward the latest problem that appears to have a technology solution and work sort of on a point-by-point basis. And that can lead to some good outcomes, but it can also leave some parts of the technology suite that's important to you unattended. So as we go into 2022, whether you're working on it or need to work on it, we'd encourage you to take a moment and look across and do a current state assessment. You may need a partner to help you do this, but develop an assessment of where you are and a roadmap to guide your working on it or to help get you started across 5 areas of technology and programming tools and data, things you use for client service and reporting, certainly fundraising and marketing data, workforce management. The last couple of years have taught us the importance of and the necessity of tools that enable us to work on a distributed basis, support remote work, also HR and administrative data and support tools, financial systems, and certainly information security. So a couple of thoughts on this. If we come back on fundraising and marketing, if you Google nonprofit technology, if you're trying to get information about technology for your nonprofit, the universe points you to fundraising tools and software. And so we'll talk a bit about some thinking on that, but you may just have to dig a bit deeper to look at some of these other areas. Nonprofits, the different benchmarks we've seen indicate they spend 3 to 4% of their budget on technology. A lot of it is traditionally in this space. And that 3 to 4% is skewed by larger nonprofits. This multitude of smaller nonprofits spend upward of that to 8 to 10 to 11 to 12%. And again, it's often around implementations of systems to support this. So just be mindful of the whole suite of technology that you need to address and the importance. We could also weave data through every one of these points. So taking a look at where the data is in your organization, how it can be better organized and accessed and secured is important as well. Now let's turn to go a little bit deeper in technology and fundraising.
Yeah, Jim, your comment about all of the signs pointing to development and fundraising when you Google the technology is very valid. So that is wonderful news if you're a fundraiser, because now there's so many more options, and many of them are so cost effective that you can afford to upgrade from your Excel sheets and your sticky notes into a system without having to launch a big giant enterprise-wide product that for many small nonprofits and even maybe some mid-sized nonprofits was cost prohibitive in the past. So definitely take a look at that if you haven't looked lately. And the comments about the fundraising and marketing data, I want to address that. So when we look at fundraising and marketing data and how does that affect our efforts in fundraising, they're just so critical. So right now, when you look, household conditions are sort of all over the map. Some of our donors are thriving and doing so well, and some are still recovering. Some still can't even see recovery in their future from our recent lockdowns and our pandemic that we've just experienced. So looking at your appeals is really worth it in 2022. How are you going to segment this? So if you don't have the technology available to segment your audiences and to segment your appeals, this will be a lot harder for you. So leveraging your technology, leveraging your marketing information and your communication tools to enable your fundraising, best tip, I think, for 2022. So segment those appeals and segment the communication vehicle. We still have donors who like paper. They like to open a letter in the mail. They love to get a handwritten thank you note. It's great to know who those people are, so you're not wholesale sending thank you notes to people that may not arrive now because their workplaces are different. They might not check the mail at an office anymore, but also the people who prefer email are going to want it a lot faster than it's going to get delivered by the mail. So their experience with you, if you were able to communicate with them using technology in a way that makes them feel so much more valued by your organization, that's really worth it. So keeping your files up to date on who has the capacity to give, who's facing challenging conditions, and I'll add a third thing in there, how they like to be communicated with is very important. And syncing that together with your marketing team so that your communications are seamless from your fundraising perspective, email, newsletters, little video clips that go out. And I saw lots of comments in the beginning from some fundraisers that you guys are looking forward to events being held again in 2022. So that's not really a technology issue, but I'm going to address that from your questions here because it can be a technology issue. Little video clips from thought leaders in your organization, from beneficiaries of your programs, telling your story and sending those out in a little email may just be some of that person-to-person connection that's going to feel really great to your donor in 2022 if we are not able to gather and have your wonderful events that we all love. So looking at technology, figuring out how can you leverage that if we don't have events, if events are still looking a little hybrid, if events are still looking a little clunky or hard to pull off, but figuring out how can you use that technology to reach them, I think is worth it and worth looking at. So I think we'll know, now we'll go back to Elizabeth and look at how this pulls together for organizational growth.
All right, so Donna and Jim have clearly outlined sort of the full scope, right? And again, back to that theme of invest, right? You're thinking through, what do we need really to enable our organization over the next year, 2 years? And so part of that's obviously software, right, that Jim and Donna were referencing. Also, there's a hardware component in terms of, some of your organizations probably had to do the mad scramble to get laptops suddenly, right, to allow for hybrid work over the last 2 years, but just making sure, again, you thought through what investments do we need to make over that, next 12, 24 months. And then, and I will certainly put myself in this bucket depending on the day, thinking through, the technology skills on your staff, right? So has everyone, I know that we all increased our technology skills literally overnight, right? Or over a 2-week period for many organizations, but really thinking through, so now that we have brought on these systems, we have moved things to the cloud and maybe have shifted some software. How do we make sure that our staff is really taking advantage of those tools that we've acquired and we're maximizing the impact on our organization? And then the other main thing to circle back around and connect two of our themes, technology in talent, right? In your human capital. So I'll just share with you guys quickly. based on a survey that just went out, it was a national survey done by Qualtrics. 35% of employees said that if they had to go back to the office full time, they would start looking for a new job, right? And that survey, I believe, just happened in October, November, and they released the data in December, which is a pretty stark number there, right? But I do want to point out that what employees are really saying in national surveys that are now sort of being released is they want a flexible workplace, right? So it's not that they don't ever want to go into an office, but they want the ability to be able to work remotely, right? Whatever that means for them, but also have some sort of space where they can come back for meetings, they can come back for that creative team time, right? In a safe way. So if you have an organization where you've got the ability to offer that type of setup, and I know certainly some of you all do have the need for in-person, a section of your workforce to be in person, thinking through, how can we build in that flexibility within our workplace? Because that is going to be something that is not really going to be a nice to have, it's going to be a need to have moving forward. And then in terms of how employees are experiencing technology, and maybe some of you have had this experience, or maybe you have a nonprofit best friend who has, only about 30% of employees in that Qualtrics survey said that their technology of their company exceeded or greatly exceeded their expectations, right? So there is still a lot of room to figure out, what are the systems that make the most sense, right, for organizations to really ensure, that productivity and that fully flexible workplace that employees are really wanting. And I will also note, and I know actually there's some friends on this session that we know, and I know that some organizations have done this already, but we're also really encouraging folks to think through, how are you utilizing your board to help you with technology, right? So as Jim kind of mentioned, at the beginning, the nonprofit sector, not necessarily a leader when it comes to technology historically, but really, that is an opportunity to think through, do we have board members, right, who might have some experience and or even networks that we can access, right? So maybe you've got, some corporate folks on your board. Maybe they're not the, IT or CIO within their company, but do they have the ability to kind of leverage, right, and bring those folks in to maybe do some of those assessments that Jim was talking about, and help identify some solutions that may fit within your organizational context. All right, now I want to hand it back to Jim to spend a little bit of time on these trends.
Okay. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And yeah, it's a matter of how do you see it? You all see things from your perspective. We're trying to bring to you the perspectives that we see across the general environment, and with working with a lot of nonprofits. And so with the appropriate, I hope the appropriate humility of this is from what we see. You are seeing different parts of the picture. We hope we're consistent and aligned. Here are some things that we would really call out and recommend, or say that this is the year to do under these headings of tactics, talent, and technology. And tactics, as an old strategy consultant, I'm very supportive of this replacement of the word strategy with tactics. Think tactically in terms of even your strategic planning. This may just be the year to revisit, reaffirm if you're on target, and realign your mission. Evaluate your programs in terms of that. Some of you have had some mission creep, some of you have not, but as your programs have come through this time of transition and change, are they having the impact that you want, or what changes might be needed to have the impact? And are they emerging as financially sustainable? Certainly it's a time to refine, as Donna said, fundraising strategies and donor communications, and think about that middle donor, think about communication preferences, think about who you're reaching out to and how you're reaching out. Talent, talent, talent. And yes, it is going to be a frustrating year in finding talent. It's going to be a frustrating year in recruiting and retaining talent. Equip yourselves. Have your role descriptions updated and aligned. Benchmark compensation levels. Get smarter about what's out there that your folks could be looking at, and do the work to build increased payroll costs into your budget. And then as Elizabeth touched on, look on the internal side and engage people in defining and enabling career opportunities for them and advancement. Increasingly, nonprofit folks who come in, even into relatively small nonprofit organizations, are mindful of and looking for their opportunities to grow and develop. So be thinking in those terms in 2022. Technology, do the assessment, have a guided roadmap, budget and implement those investments. And as Donna's highlighted, there are some areas where you might get the return in value in communicating with donors and supporters that can enable funding investments in other areas. And that notion of how your workforce interacts with technology to build that flexible workplace and sustain it through applying technology to your work is going to be very important. Inform these tactics, come into work every day with a mindset of how is the culture? How are we advancing the culture? How is our culture engaging people in the work of doing these things? And from a diversity, equity, and especially inclusion point of view, are we being practical and action-oriented and bringing that lens to how we do this work? Are we bringing the right voices to the table for these decisions? Are we enabling and equipping everyone in our organization? Are we bringing that representation into the very day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month decisions that help shape the course of your nonprofit? Y'all have been so kind to listen and to share with us. We do want to highlight that GCN brings resources to the nonprofit community here, and we want to make sure you have access to those resources and aware of them. Certainly, membership has its benefits, and so we encourage you to, if you're not a member, to join and have the opportunity to participate in some special events oriented toward members. Nonprofit University is a great resource for investing in your people. Courses, and there's a subscription option that can be quite economical to get more people into your in your organization into some professional development. And certainly our consulting team is eager to work and out there working nonprofits across the state. We worked with over 200 nonprofits last year, and certainly one-to-one projects, individual projects with organizations, and also we have formed cohorts and had the opportunity to have those where smaller nonprofits or nonprofits of particular interest can come together, and we consult and work with them on a cohort basis. And I really appreciate the comment that Mike Donlan made in here about rate of change. And he owns up that in prior decades, half of what he knew went obsolete every 18 months. Now it feels like it's about 3 months, maybe even less. And what a great way to speak to this uncertainty, ambiguity that is surrounding us all. And we're hopeful that today's presentation has been helpful to you to address that and how to get your hands on and get your organization aligned in light of this through working on talent, thinking through the lenses of talent, technology, and tactics, as well as working on culture as you bring things to fruition. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's been our privilege to spend this time with you. Appreciate it very much.